Howdy. You're probably wondering, Ryan, why aren't you in the garage working on the car? You're always in the garage working on the car. Well, I had a bit of an issue with the engine in the E34. It kind of slowly died, if you will. I did a compression and leak down test not too long ago, and it was clearly on its way out. The lowest compression number was 60 psi, and I think the leak down on that cylinder was 45%, which is really, really bad. This motor was sort of a junkyard budget, get the car on the road and boosted kind of thing. We built it when I didn't have a ton of money to dump into it, so it did a good job for what it was, but it no longer wants to do its job. I think cylinder 2, when I unplugged the coil pack from it when it was idling, didn't change the idle at all. So that cylinder isn't contributing at all to the work that the engine is doing. So I need to tear it out. Thankfully, I had sort of the foresight to see that this was coming, and I've started to develop a new build, which is very exciting. I can finally do the build correctly. So these next 2, 3, 4, however many videos are basically just going to be me from start to finish, taking the old motor out, tearing it apart, and putting together a new one. So I'll be doing some commentary over the video. The videos of me tearing out the motor aren't going to be this crisp and high quality. I use the GoPro for that. It's a little bit more convenient, but the engine tearing apart and rebuilding is using this camera, so it should be pretty pleasing to watch, I think. So let's get to it. So you'll hear me mention this in a minute, but I decided to pull this motor out during the coldest snap of the year. At some points it was -20, -30 actual temperature. I think this day, and I'll show it in a minute here, I think it was -6. So it's been sitting in an icy grave. So the first thing we had to do to get the motor out was pull it out of that icy grave, and you can see here that the door is kind of frozen shut. So we're using my dad's truck to just hook onto the tow hook and pull it out. The car's been sitting here for about a month, so it's kind of iced in. It is pretty cold, -6. Actual temperature says it feels like -22, which is accurate. Chose a bad time to swap a motor, but better to get it done before it warms up, I guess. Okay. So at this point, we've got it in the garage, and you can already tell that there's snow and ice all over this thing. My dad, thankfully, was helping with brushing some of that off and getting it outside. If you're in one of the snowy states, you know that you bring your car in from outside and all the snow melts, and that really sucks when you're underneath the car trying to do stuff and it's just wet and slushy and disgusting. So thanks, Dad, for that. That made my life a whole lot easier. At this point, I'm just getting it jacked up so I can get underneath it. First order of business, or first half of this, is essentially all under the car. With the E34, I like to separate the transmission and the engine, so I'll basically go through the process of taking the transmission out as if I needed to do a clutch job or something like that. And then at that point, you just have an engine sitting on engine mounts, and you can take all the topside stuff off and use a crane and pull it out. So the first step of basically getting the transmission out, I've got a 3-inch exhaust that goes back. That makes my life quite a bit easier. The stock exhaust is not very fun to take off. One, it's very heavy, and two, there's usually rusted stuff, and the hangers, you gotta kind of pry them off and whatever. So the custom exhaust in this case makes my life a little bit easier. So I'll go ahead and pop that off here, and then we'll go from there. I'll go ahead and pop the O2 sensor off of the downpipe here. Another added benefit of the custom exhaust is that the O2 sensor is a lot easier to get to. Another thing is that, as you can tell, I just have the downpipe in my hand. The entire exhaust is split into like 3 pieces, whereas your stock exhaust is just one long, heavy piece of tubing. Here I'm taking off the heat shield that covers the center of the drive shaft so that I can get the drive shaft out. At that point, the transmission will be disconnected from the diff at the back, and then I'll go ahead and move towards taking the transmission out. Here I'm taking the nuts and bolts off that hold the flex disc between the transmission and the drive shaft. And then the joint from the drive shaft to the differential. At this point, the drive shaft is removed and all of the bell housing bolts have been removed, along with the transmission mount bracket that holds it to the chassis of the car. This is typically kind of an arduous process for most people. I've broken them loose enough and put anti-seize on them that they don't tend to stick. A lot of the issues people have is with even getting a wrench up towards the top ones. I've found that using a 30-degree bent socket wrench with maybe a 2-inch extension, I can get to all of the bolts by essentially hugging the transmission with both arms and cracking them loose.
We can just drag it on the ground. I feel like
Next step is to drain all the coolant out of the car, so I've got my radiator plug there, and you also have to drain it out of the block, which I'll have a clip of just in a second. I have a coolant line with a banjo bolt running to the turbo, so mine is a little bit different than a stock setup where you would normally just have a bolt there. So at this point, I've moved on to the top side, which is arguably a little bit easier. You need to be sort of methodical about how you're taking this apart so that you can get it back together. And additionally, when you do pull the motor out, you want to make sure that you're not going to snag on anything or you forgot to disconnect something. And for that reason, I like to keep my Bentley manual out. I've done this enough times at this point where it's really not too big of a deal to take the motor out, but I do like the way that they label their electrical connectors so that it's really easy to put them back together. So whatever you do, I would at least label the things that all look the same, especially electrical plugs, so that when you do put it back together, you can put it back together correctly. I've had a few people message me and try to help them with their car because it's not starting, and it's just because they flipped like an idle control valve plug around. So I like to label them so that I don't have that frustration in the future. So at this point, you've seen I've taken the radiator and the intercooler out and the catch can lines. And I also need to take off the throttle cables off the throttle body. And you saw me take a picture of that there, so I remember which one goes to which part of the throttle. Now it's time to get the injectors out of the way, which requires that you remove the fuel feed and return. If you're able to, while the engine is still capable of being cranked over, you can pull the fuel pump fuse out and just crank it over a little bit. It might start up and just let it die. It clears the fuel rail of any fuel pressure. I did not do that here, so I got fuel dumped around. Since I know that I'm not going to be starting this for a while, it wasn't that big of a deal to me. So you can see I took the intake manifold off there and the injectors with the fuel rail. And essentially now it's just a matter of disconnecting electrical connectors and labeling them. There's one half of the wiring harness out. I just like to set that on the windshield. And the other half goes to the coil packs. And in my specific scenario, with that metal vanity cover on the valve cover, the compressor housing of the turbo has to come off for me to get that off so that I can unplug the coil packs. On a stock motor without a turbo sitting there and without that steel vanity plate, this is way easier. It's probably one of my bigger gripes with the turbo being there. It just makes it kind of a pain. Spark plugs used to take, maybe 20 minutes, if that, and now it takes me about, half an hour to an hour to even get to the spark plugs. Now the last couple pieces of the puzzle here. The engine is basically just sitting on the engine mounts at this point, so I just need to take the nuts and washers off of those, and it should be ready to come out. I put the compressor housing of the turbo back on because the wheel on the compressor is very easy to bend, and I don't want to do that if it bumps on something when the engine's getting pulled, so I put that back on there for safety reasons. Here we go. We unfortunately had to open the garage door to get the engine crane in the right spot to lift the motor out, and we tried to do this very methodically because it was nighttime on the same day that it was -6, so it was even colder, and the garage is heated and we didn't want to lose too much heat.
But it was bent, like, it didn't bend.
Well, that's the end of the removal video. We'll get this out, get it on an engine stand, drain the oil, and start tearing it apart to see why it's running so poorly. So stay tuned for that.